And now, the moment you all have been waiting for. It's time for the Rad N Bad podcast by Hickory Learning Group. Here are your hosts, Mike Carrero and Sean Yocum.
All right, welcome back to Rad N Bad. Yep, this is where we don't just talk about applied behavior analysis. We challenge it, we question it, and quite frankly, sometimes we make the field a little uncomfortable. Because guess what? Growth does not happen in comfort. It happens in friction. And today, like any other day here on the Rad N Bad podcast, we're stepping directly into one of the most controversial conversations happening in ABA right now. Assent. You've probably heard it. You've probably debated it. And depending on who you ask, assent is either the future of ethical ABA or what we're doing today, or it's the beginning of clinical regression. And some clinicians argue if a child doesn't assent, we stop. Others argue if we always stop, we never prepare them for the real world. And then there's the radical behaviorist perspective. So there's a lot to dive into. But first, we got to check in with the other co-host, the left side of the brain. What's the really analytical?
I feel
one?
like we can't go left and right. We have to go front and back. So we just get both halves of it.
Yeah. Are you the front or the back of the brain? I don't even know.
I don't know.
You're the front today. Mike is the front of the brain. So Mike Carrero, how are you today?
I am doing well. As always, these are some of the more intense episodes. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. I mean, we're about to ask an even more uncomfortable question. Like, from a radical behaviorist perspective, like, does assent even exist? Like, we'll touch on that. Because if you are a radical behaviorist, you reject free will, internal decision-making, hypothetical constructs, but I digress, right? We will get into that. But let's just start here. I mean, this is going to be a bold one. I think right now assent has become one of the most emotionally charged topics in applied behavior analysis. What's interesting to me, Mike, and you might agree with me, I think people are treating it like an ethical evolution. And then there's other people like that are treating it like clinical regression.
Mm.
I think the point that we're trying to make when we do these episodes is like both sides have a point. But if we're really going to have this conversation, I'm hoping with this episode, we can get a little deeper. We can talk about radical behaviorism. We need to talk about free will. We need to talk about whether assent is even a real construct at all. Because if we start to dive into some of this stuff, maybe assent doesn't even actually exist through our lens. What's your take on that?
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, the reality of it is the more talking we do, the better we understand everything. Very, very transparently, I think that a lot of the terminology that we use in our field oftentimes gets scapegoated. And so you hear one person train it one time and you have either a really positive or negative experience with it. And that becomes the overgeneralization for everything. I think at the core of everything, and this is, when we look at the future of ABA as a whole, the aspect of adhering to the science and understanding the science is really important, because poor practice implementation and poor usage of the science doesn't dictate that the science is bad because our science is neutral.
Yeah, we talk about that all the time. It's the professional practice of ABA that is tarnishing the science of ABA. So like any episode, I think we got to define it first, right? So what exactly is assent? If we were to come up with some like objective definition. So most clinicians in the field today, I guess, would define it as it's verbal agreement mixed with some nonverbal cooperation. There's objective analysis of like they seem engaged in therapy. It's basically the idea that consent is like the legal aspect of something, but assent is the behavioral buy-in. I think most people would say the concept has grown alongside with like trauma-informed ABA, neurodiversity advocacy, client dignity movements, anti-compliance training. I think at face value, I mean, yeah, shoot, that sounds incredibly reasonable, right? Like if you think of all that stuff, you're just like, yeah, absolutely. That sounds absolutely reasonable. I think the goal is simple. It's don't force kids to do things, respect their voice, teach autonomy. Sounds ethical, sounds compassionate, sounds human. But as a person who is trained in behavior analysis, we don't typically operate on what sounds right. We operate on what is observable, measurable, and environmentally determined. And I think that's where things can get a little complicated when we try to define it. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way that I define it is like readiness behaviors, right? If I had to like really make it compact, I define it as readiness. I think as a whole, the concept of assent and dissent is really, really important because it gives us an objective lens to work through, right? You referenced the aspect of cooperation or in certain instances, a level of like compliance in the task, right? I'm not saying you need to comply, but you are doing it of your own volition as a like means to continue in the activity. I think that's super important because that determines whether or not we should or shouldn't proceed with something. It doesn't mean we won't. It means that in that very moment, we might pause in order to like be more ready. Um, but I agree with you. I think there's a lot of subjectivity in the matter, and we'll kind of unpack that here in a little bit because my thoughts, feelings, and emotions should not be impacting someone else's assent, but I genuinely think that happens a lot more than people are aware of.
Yeah. Well, I think the best way that we can go about this, Mike, is basically just go back with like pros and cons. Like we'll play a little game of ping pong. If I wrote a few down, take your spin on it as I'm saying it. If you could think of something afterwards, shoot it out there. But let's, I think, start with the strongest case for assent, like the first pro. I don't think anybody is ever going to argue against this, but assent promotes self-advocacy. I don't think there's any question about that. When a learner has the ability to say no and we honor that, we are teaching them something incredibly powerful. You're basically teaching that learner that their voice matters. And that's especially, can't even talk today, Mike, especially important for, setting personal boundaries, abuse prevention, medical autonomy, consent education. I think if we teach a child that adults always override them, we may unintentionally teach, well, guess what? Your discomfort doesn't matter. And I think that's a dangerous lesson.
100%. And that is a lifelong skill, right? This is a skill that they can use in a variety of different fashions. And to your point regarding, taking that away from somebody, I think that's equally as important. And I think that's kind of where our first pinpoint of issue, frustration, poor implementation kind of lies. So I'll give you some of the tentative cons that I've heard against some of these things. And I want to kind of preface before we continue a little bit. These are not specifically our thoughts regarding whether or not assent or dissent is good or bad or how you should implement it. It's just the objective like lens of what both sides of the coin might actually be seeing. On the opposite side of self-advocacy, right? I could argue that it's promoting escape and avoidance, right? At what point do we, I've heard this from staff, families, friends, peers, colleagues, you name it, right? At what point do I say no and we continue? At what point is I need a break no longer an option and we continue? And to that question, I give the same kind of answer of we have to identify other skills in addition to this, as opposed to, well, they asked for a break, so I give them a break. I think that's, again, like we talked about the first issue of implementation. It's not just, oh, they are saying they're not ready, so we're just never going to be ready. Well, that is the honest truth if you don't give them other skills, if you don't show other coping strategies. So I can't expect it to change if you're not changing and giving them something. But I think that's the opposite aspect of it.
Yeah, the first con I had written down, and this kind of touches on this, is safety situations where you may unintentionally reinforce escape, avoidance, and unsafe behavior if we're just honoring assent all the time. I think the conversation gets real when it's like, oh, well, what about running into traffic? Or
you're in a burning building, you're in a movie theater.
Or what about taking medication? Or there a life-saving medical procedure, or a hygiene task, or I don't know, you're engaging in aggression towards other people, including maybe the staff that are working with that individual. I think these are moments where waiting for assent is actually not an option. And I think the anti-assent crowd would argue if we teach that no always stops demands, you're going to unintentionally reinforce escape, avoidance, and unsafe behavior. And again, it's not about compliance when we frame it this way. It's about safety and independence. That's what it's about. The other pro I wrote down on here was it builds rapport. I think in the beginning when you're honoring assent, you see a therapist stopping a demand, right? That initial individual that you're working with, objectively might start engaging in some behaviors that we could define as like, oh, they seem more relaxed, whatever that's defined as, right? That therapist becomes a safe space. Now therapy becomes collaborative. It becomes reinforcing. It becomes engaging. It's now not coercive. It's now not aversive. It's not compliance driven. And I think from a behavioral standpoint, rapport is what then defines the reinforcement history. Because when we look at that type of care model, what that winds up doing is if you build rapport, you now have stronger MO for participation. You are going to lead to better instructional control, and you're going to have less escape maintain behavior. So in other words, assent isn't just ethical. It may be actually more effective when you're using it to build rapport.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's very, very valid. I think the piece that's potentially missing is the implementers function of their own behaviors, right? We've both worked in a variety of different settings, so I'll ask the question: have you ever have staff that just really want to be liked by their learner?
Oh yeah,
right? I don't want them to not like me, right? Because again, it's kind of crappy when the person you're supposed to be taking care of doesn't really want you with them in that moment. And that's where I kind of have the be the bad guy, not the mean person conversation, right? Our job is to be able to build rapport, support, and push individuals to be more independent, to be more autonomous, to understand that in the life aspect of skills, if assent worked 100% of the time, nothing would ever get done.
Yeah.
Right? Unfortunately, that is the reality, right? There are days that you don't want to do things, that I don't want to do things. There are moments where we wish we could just say, you know what, I'm done. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Or there are other implications that happen as a result of that, right? Live example, all of a sudden I go, Sean, I don't want to work anymore. You're still going to pay me. I don't think that's how that works.
No.
Right? That would be great, but that's called PTO, right? And that is an option, but there are consequences to said option. I think we have to do a better job of explaining that. But circling back to that first point of people want to be liked and that rapport goes both ways, I think that's where we as professionals have to do a better job of supporting implementation, because that is exactly what I want. I want you to build quality rapport with the individual so that they have the environment that is productive and conducive for learning. And we understand that, oh, you know what? Life does get hard every once in a while, or, half of the time, let's say. However, I have this person that I can rely on because they have presented themselves as, an SD for comfort or reinforcer availability and all of the fun things, right? It's like, having the friend, quote unquote. I know after a long day, I can give you a call and say, hey, this happened, right? That comes through rapport building. It doesn't mean that you might not check me and give me hey, you kind of were being out of pocket. It just means that you owe it to us in that relationship to build those skills.
Yeah, you're basically touching on the reality gap. The world does not operate on assent, like how the current structure of the world is in life. There are school expectations that exist. There are jobs require a certain level of performance. Now, again, there's accommodations for some things, but there's still a required level of performance for that skill set. Doctors require cooperation for medical procedures. Safety demands compliance. There's laws that need to be followed, right? For the safety of, the greater ecosystem that you live in. Life includes delayed reinforcement. Life includes non-preferred tasks. Life includes levels of discomfort. Life includes frustration. So if therapy only happens when learners, quote unquote, want to participate, well, are we actually preparing them for reality, or are we creating fragile tolerance? And I think that's where that reality gap argument comes in. And I don't think it's unreasonable, because independence requires task persistence, like you were talking about. It requires some level of tolerance. It requires being able to be flexible. It requires resilience. And to your point, these are all skills that are often learned when you're doing therapy. So like that rapport building is crucial in the beginning to create that safe space for the learning environment. But if we're just constantly in a rapport building stage and we're not teaching skills, we're not preparing learners for real life.
100%. And you just reminded me of like another potential taboo topic for another mythical middle ground, pairing. That's the first word that comes to mind if we're never doing that ever again, and there's no demands ever happening. I'll put this as a little teaser for a future episode of pairing is not a 2-week process where you just do nothing and give Johnny whatever he wants.
It's an everyday process.
I hate that aspect of it. But this is, again, talking about implementation of the skill, right? If I don't know you from a hole in the wall, right? And you engage in X, Y, and Z interfering behaviors that are preventing you from learning, preventing you from being more independent, or they're unsafe, right? Am I going to just come in and give you like a block of instruction? No, it's not going to work, right? So we follow kind of the Assent model where we're looking at, okay, I need to give you a practical skill that is functional and will meet your needs wherever they are, right? That could be in the shape of, instead of you punching me in the face, you push me away. And then we slowly start shaping that skill, right? But the reality of it is, and I'm making the infamous like justification there where it's really ridiculous of you wouldn't ever accept someone just pushing you away like that, right? But if we didn't push and continue to shape that skill, what would happen? We would push everybody away. That's the same concept as, no, I don't want to do that. No, I'm not doing that, right? Versus with the same individual with all those same impacts and interfering behaviors. We started with pushing, and then through a shaping process, we built functional skills that led to an increased tolerance with delayed reinforcers that then shaped that into, leave me alone, give me space, I'm not ready. And then continuing the shaping model, what do? We adapt that, because now that I'm not ready is, no, I hear you, but we have to go. The appointment's in 30 minutes and we're already 5 minutes behind, right? And that's like, again, think of it like a parenting skill. This is when we talk about this as a concept, we're using it in like a limited lens of just our field, right? Take your ABA hat off for a second, Sean, right? You've got a child. Do you voluntarily as a parent ever go against Assent for your child because of the fact that the need for them outweighs the need for sitting and finishing something in like a video game?
All the time.
Right? Because that's realistic, and that's the actual outcome of that situation outweighs violating the Assent model. And I think that's also when we talk about things like social validity, right? Unfortunately, there are certain things that we have to support and push through, not because I want to be a mean person, not because I don't like you, not because I don't care about you. And I want to be clear here, I'm not forcing you to do anything, because that's quite unethical, right? But the outcome here does have to be sustained. And I think that's the difference between, compliance and coercion versus like compassion and support. Because in some way, shape, or form throughout your life, you're going to be upset. Someone is going to upset you because you didn't get the immediate access to something, or it wasn't the outcome you expected, or you advocated and it didn't work. If we prepare you now, for those things and build that tolerance and build those coping skills, that's going to mean the world of a difference, instead of when you're in my age and we're like, oh, someone finally said no to me. Now what?
Yeah, it's such a good point, because that's going to touch on later when we're talking about, okay, what's the middle ground? The middle ground is shaping. But we got to dive deeper, Mike. I think we need to put our radical behaviorism hat on, because that is our scope. Because I think that now we're going to make this whole debate even more complicated. Because number one, if you truly are practicing within the scope of radical behaviorism, which is basically what our education is, it's what our certification is in. Radical behaviorism rejects free will, internal causation, hypothetical constructs, right? Instead, behavior is determined by reinforcement history, environmental contingencies, motivating operations, stimulus control. So when we say something like, the child doesn't assent. Well, no, like what does that actually mean? Because assent is not observable, right? What we actually observe is escape behavior, avoidance, some level of emotional responding. We're looking if we can objectively define what engagement looks like, latency to completing a task, compliance, right? So from a radical behaviorist perspective, assent is actually a hypothetical construct. It's a label that we are placing on behavior under certain environmental conditions. So from that perspective, there is no such thing as assent.
I agree with you. And I agree with you because it's the same concept that I do when I talk about like emotions. Again, I don't want to make it seem as though we don't believe in emotions, right? But that's a mentalistic concept, right? When you look at assent, you can't behaviorally define it without an individual present, right? It's not like a quantity. If I have a quantity of 1, then there is one item. Doesn't matter what it is. 1 is 1, and it will always be 1. Assent, we can call it readiness, but think of it like, you know what RBF is, right? Well, that can be seen as mad. Are you mad? I don't know. And so unless we're going to walk up to people and say, are you ascending right now? And your assent behaviors are this, right? Then it doesn't inherently work. And it's a flawed conceptualization of something. However, we do this very consistently with abstract concepts, right? And I think that's also important because we're not saying that assent doesn't exist behaviorally, because it does for the individual, but that has to be clearly defined for the individual. In the same aspect of emotions don't inherently exist, the behavior associated with the emotion does. Because when I say sad, you might think crying. I might think laughing, because you can do those things when you're feeling sad. It just depends. It's the same thing with angry. You can be crying and be mad, or you can laugh at the situation, right? But we have to clearly define it for the individual. And I think, to your point, until we actually objectively define it and remove those projections, whether it's based off of my history or their history, then we're not going to actually be able to understand it. And you also referenced the environment. As behavior analysts, what is the most important thing to us?
The environment.
Bingo. Which means by far one of the first things that I ever ask someone when I'm walking up to them in either a crisis or just a learning opportunity or just in general, right, is, hey, what are you guys teaching right now? Because something is being reinforced. Something, right? You get to choose what is or isn't being reinforced. And I'll be honest, sometimes you don't know and don't realize until you're like, oh crap, I missed it, right? But what does that set you up for in the future? A new learning opportunity to recorrect or address that situation. But no, it's the same concept as free will. Free will can't inherently exist because your choices are defined based off of your previous reinforcement histories.
Yep, it's just behavior under contingency. So like I feel like the assent is just it's a label. So it's a tact for whatever are the defining behaviors for that individual. So I think with it being a hypothetical construct, assent can be a topography if it's objectively defined. If you can sit there and say, assent is defined as this and this and this and this and this under these contingencies, right? We're not asking, does the learner assent? We're actually looking at, okay, what contingencies are producing that behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if a learner refuses, that's not a philosophical stance. That's just behavior shaped by history, reinforcement, aversive conditions, skill deficits, right? So the question should never be, should we honor assent? That should not be the question. It should never be, should we honor assent? It's like, no. Why is the environment producing escape behavior right now?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Right? Because that reframes the entire conversation. Why is this environment producing escape maintain behavior? Why is this individual now engaging in behavior that is not labeled as assent? So then if we know that, it's just data. It's not an ethical rule. Assent is not an ethical rule. It's just data. It's just the right way to do behavior analysis.
So with you explaining it in that manner, the like a simple way that I can put it for others to potentially think differently is these are antecedent and consequence strategies, right? If you are ascending to learning, it means your antecedent strategies have worked. It means that what you have done before engaging in this new behavior in this environment means you've prepped us for success. If we are descending and going down and no longer ready to learn, guess what? That's where your consequence interventions come into place to say, oh, X, Y, and Z happened. I'm doing A, B, C now so that we can get back into this ascending model,
Yep.
right? It's very plainly a rebrand of concepts that we already have. And it, again, I don't disagree with the like conceptualization of it because it's easy, put it in a flow chart, right? Ascent means up and you're ready to keep going. Descent means you're going down and you're not ready to keep going. It's very easy to explain, but I think, right, because it's easy to explain, it's difficult to interpret.
It's a buzzword.
Mhm.
It's straight up like I don't want to lie about it anymore. Like it's a buzzword. And if anybody out there is saying that you are like, oh, I practice assent-based care, right? What you're actually doing, could it actually be assent? Because if we actually frame it like this, if we know from our behavior analytic lens that we are we are basically shaping the environment to shape behavior, then I could argue that someone is not making choice and someone is just responding to the environmental contingencies. So in fact, if you are manipulating the environment to get assent-based behavior, you technically are not honoring assent in your own definition. It's just circular reasoning. Because if you're sitting there and saying, okay, well, we now need to change this condition so we can get some sort of assent and we can get the client to assent into session or assent into the therapy, right? It's not choice making. It's just you're creating a more reinforcing environment for that learner to then engage in a behavior within that particular environment. So I honestly don't think there is such a thing as assent. It's just good behavior analysis and ethical behavior analysis to teach skills that will change an individual's life so they can engage in self-advocacy and things of those nature.
Absolutely. And I think in that same point, right, talking about like creating and like, I like to think of this and again, I'll make the equivocation. I'm not calling people animals. But like talking about like positive only dog training, right? I'm all for it. I think it's good. However, having multiple tools in your toolbox doesn't make you a bad person. And what happens when you run out of food? Right? What happens when I don't have any more treats and now it's hit the fan and I can't get my dog back? Right? Okay, I need to have a backup. Same thing with assent and descent, right? I would love it if the like assent model was 100% ascending all the time, but then let's be honest, why would I be working with you?
Yep.
You don't have behaviors that need to be supported and modified and like independence to be nurtured and grown. So that again would put a break in what we actually are here to do. And if you say you're only doing that, I would argue that you're A, not doing that, and B, your implementation of it is historically inaccurate, because that implies that your individuals 100% of the time will always want to and continue to learn, which by all means, if you have figured that out, please let everybody know. But it's just not realistic, because someone somewhere sometime over something is going to say, no, you can't do that, or yes, you're going to do that.
Yeah, it's I think this is where things get interesting, and I don't want people to think like I'm sitting here and just shitting all over Assent. What I'm basically saying is, if we were practicing applied behavior analysis the way the science is intended to be practiced, um, you would not support forced compliance, and you also would not support unlimited refusal. It's the very reason we have this middle ground topic with this. We are basically engineering environments where participation is reinforced. That's basically what we're doing. It's shaping. I mean, you hit it before. We're basically shaping by starting small, honoring functional communication, teaching break, please, not yet, help, different activity, right? We're reinforcing that refusal to build that skill instead of the escape maintain behavior. So now we're engineering that environment that says, oh, well, this person is honoring my words, and this person is reinforcing this new behavior. And then you slowly start to build tolerance, and you slowly start to use that high density reinforcement schedule. So that way you make participation reinforcing. You make it where it's not compliance and not coercion. It's just good behavioral design. And I think a lot of people look at that and they think like, oh, well, that's just compliance-based therapy and that's coercion. It's like, no, that's just good behavioral design. I would argue that it's ethical, because you're actually sitting there and teaching and preparing the person for the real life. I think the whole Assent thing came about as a marketing thing, as a buzzword thing, same as trauma-informed care. I think it's just all buzzwords that we're trying to rebrand because of poor professional practice and terrible social validity from people that we're practicing. And, we're quote unquote evolving, but all we're basically doing is just using the science and using it correctly. That's all that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to like any ethical conundrum that we've ever found ourselves in, whether it's in our science or as a culture and history of like our species, right? We learn and evolve through experience, ABA, right? And that level of reinforcement history associated with things. And hey, we learned that that was bad. And would you argue that we should have learned those things a long time ago? Probably, right? Should there have been more of a forefront for advocacy and change? Always, right? Because if you can save an individual from a level of trauma, discomfort, etc., then why wouldn't you? But the reality of it is, that's always going to continue to happen in some facet as we continue to learn and grow and develop, not only as individuals, but as a science and as a society.
Yeah. And honestly, Mike, the whole point of doing this episode was just to show like the real enemy of this is just poor behavioral design. That's literally what it is. It's poor behavioral design. So if your therapy requires force, if it's requiring you to force somebody to do something, well, you're probably missing motivation. You're probably not building rapport or pairing. You're not shaping skills. You have piss poor reinforcement schedules and a piss poor environmental design. Now, if therapy stops every time a learner refuses, well, guess what? Now you're probably missing persistence, resilience, real world application, real world preparation, tolerance training, right? These are all really important. So like neither extreme works in this situation, right? Because the science doesn't choose size. The science doesn't choose a side. It basically analyzes contingencies. And that's what we should be doing as practitioners, is saying, okay, based on this individual, where are they at right now? I need to make sure that I am engineering this environment for success, so that way this person is learning. That's the point of this episode. Any
110%.
Other closing thoughts, Mike?
No, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to do better, right? Take everything we've said with a grain of salt. I hope it resonates with you all as a result of questioning, not only where you've been, but where you're heading. But when it comes to assent, it sounds simple, but like most things in behavior analysis, unfortunately, it's not. Because when we strip away emotion and look through just a radical behaviorism style lens, we're left with something important. Assent isn't a feeling. Assent isn't a moral construct. Assent is behavior under contingencies. And if a learner refuses, that's data. If a learner engages, that's also data. And our job isn't to choose between a level of compliance or autonomy. Our job is to design environments where participation and voluntary and engagement becomes reinforcement. So instead of asking, did they assent? Maybe we should ask, what did we reinforce? What are we trying to teach? How can I support this more? Because at the end of the day, we're not just shaping behavior. We're shaping experiences. We're shaping independence. And we're shaping the future of this field. Until next time, stay rad and bad.
Peace.